The Sunday after of Christmas, rushing things a little bit, always is a text that seems out of order. We don't get to the wise men until next Sunday. But that's a reminder to us that we have no idea when the wise men showed up. And the fact is, we take this Sunday to talk about Jesus and his growing up. Either his maturing as a child and being nurtured at home, or as the blessings that were put upon him, the recognition of his messiahship by two elderly people. Today we talk about an event that occurred in his life at the age of 12. Having a family can be a real challenge. As one humorist has put it, who could ever forget Winston Churchill's immortal words, "We shall fight on the beaches, we will fight on the landing grounds, we will fight in the fields and in the streets, we will fight in the hills." And as that humorist said, and that's only talking about your family vacation. Some of you can relate to that. Sometimes it is difficult in family life. In fact, corporate America tries to help us a little bit. Some of you have had the experience of traveling with your kids and back and saying those immortal words, "If you don't settle down, I'm going to stop the car and bring out the belt or give you a lecture or we're going to turn around," whatever it may be that you said. Well, Toyota has come out with something that is helpful, they think. It's a PA system in their cars that you can switch it on and you can tell your kids to quiet down and the speakers in back will carry your voice. That way you don't have to turn around and look at them. Technology is great, except that technology is often a large part of the problem that we have. Everyone seems to have earbuds of some sort listening to their music. Very often we find people are staring at their smartphones or they're looking on their computers on the internet. They're Googling everything, but they're not really paying attention. A man by the name of Daniel Burris, who's a futurist, tells about a friend of his who was looking forward to a vacation. His family was going to be driving across country. And he was looking forward to it because his kids were getting older and he realized this might be one of the last times they were able to take a really significant vacation together. When they got back, Burris asked his friend how it went. And he said, "Well, it was a pretty good vacation." He said, "But we really didn't talk much." And Burris said, "Why?" She said, "Well, all of us were listening to our own music on our phones or Walkmans or whatever they were using at that point. And so we really didn't talk about anything." And Burris said, "How sad it is. Here's a great time in which family could have been talking about certain things as they traveled together. The irony is they went on the same vacation, but it really wasn't a vacation together." Most of us can relate to that. Another thing we're dealing with now in society is something that is referred to as helicopter parents. Parents who are constantly hovering over the lives of their kids. Sometimes we discover that kids get involved in sports not because they're really interested in them, but because the parents think they should. How many of you have been parents who made your kids learn to play the piano or play an instrument that never really seemed to fit the kids? Well, it's getting really bad in China with these helicopter parents. One Chinese university has set up a dormitory for overly protective parents. They've discovered that there are many parents who don't want to let their kids go. They go off to college and somehow the parents sort of follow them behind. They offer to cook for them, to launder for them. They rent an apartment by them. Or some of them were actually literally moving into the dorm with their kids. And the university said, this isn't working. And so they set up a separate place for the parents to live so that the kids could have at least some time alone. In today's lesson from Luke's Gospel, we realize very quickly that Mary and Joseph were not helicopter parents. It takes place when Jesus was 12 years old. He had traveled to Jerusalem with his parents for the Passover. Mary and Joseph were devout people. It says in the text that every year they went to Passover. This was no small feat. It was probably a trip that would take about a week's time to get there, a week to get back. And the festival was actually 8 days long. After it was over, they headed back. And I don't want you to think that Mary and Joseph were too terribly bad of parents, because usually the people traveled in what's often called a caravan or a large group of people. The men and the older boys tended to be at the rear. The women and the younger children tended to be up in front. Just like even today, we often discover that parties or whatnot often degenerate into men's section and women's section. It wasn't until the end of the day that they realized that Jesus, who they assumed was with the other or with a group of his friends somewhere in between, was not with them. They would hurry back to Jerusalem. It would take 3 days to find him. They found him in the temple. He was in the temple court with the teachers of the law and others who were giving instructions, and he was talking and asking questions and giving opinions that he himself seemed to have come to. And everyone was amazed, especially his parents. What in the world was going on? And we see that something important has happened here. Because the text gives us a hint. Not that Mary and Joseph left him behind, but the text says he intentionally stayed behind. Now, I want you to understand that a 12-year-old in that society was older than 12-year-olds today. Even in Jewish society now, you hit 12 years of age and you have a bar mitzvah or a bath mitzvah. It's a signaling of coming of age. It's sort of similar to confirmation in some respects. But the fact is that it is indeed an event that signaled sort of a step into adulthood. These children had probably been taking all kinds of responsibility from a much younger age than we find in our society. These kids grew up faster because they had chores to do. They had responsibilities that maybe kids today do not do. Mary asked the question, "Son, how could you treat us this way? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you." And Jesus sort of retorts in a loving but also very serious way when he says, "Didn't you know I would have been in my Father's house?" Luke says they did not understand that. And then he goes on to say that Jesus went down to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them, but his mother treasured all these things in her heart. And Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and men and women. Already at 12, Jesus was conscious of his special relationship with God. Now, notice, as one commentator has pointed out, how gently but definitively Jesus takes the name Father away from Joseph and says, "Didn't you know I would be in my Father's house?" His statement to Mary confirmed that he knew his mission and thought his parents would also have known his mission. After all, both of them had had angelic meetings to prepare them for his birth. They had been told by the wise men that angels had appeared to them. The Magi came somewhere along the line. They would have to flee down to Egypt when Herod got upset and would be refugees for a number of years before Herod died and they could move back north. They knew this was a special child. Should they have not been more prepared? It was a very special relationship with God that caused Jesus to be mindful of God's call in his life. And it was because of his relationship with God that we are told that he would honor his mother and father, following the Ten Commandments. We believe that Joseph died relatively young, leaving a younger family, and Jesus would have to take a responsibility as the eldest child to be the man of the house, at least until younger brothers could take his place in the carpenter shop in Nazareth, before he could start his public ministry. But he knew from a young age that he had a special job to do. This shouldn't be all that unusual. We know that some children very early in life have a very keen insight in what they want to do with their lives. Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple Computer, knew from a very early age, he said from age 13, what he wanted to do with his life. He was enamored by computers. He wanted to do nothing else but work with computers. Of course, many of us, when we were 12 or 13, were like the second grade boy who was asked by his teacher what he wanted to be when he grew up, and he just shrugged and he said, "Gee, I don't know. I haven't even decided what I want to be for Halloween." Some children know and many don't. I mean, there are many 30-year-olds who graduated from college who still have no idea what they should do with their lives. And many of adults out there find themselves in a very similar situation. They may have started a career and the career disappeared, or they've gotten tired of the career. I remember when I was in seminary, we had a youth ministry program at North Park in conjunction with Young Life. One of the things the seminary professors said repeatedly to many of those in that degree, you know, you only have to do a little bit more to go on and get an MDiv. You really should do that because you may really be enthused about youth ministry today. But you may discover that you're one of those people who loses touch with the kids because you're now in a different generation. There are some people who can be in youth ministry until they're ready to retire. But most people can't. Many people today find themselves changing jobs because the jobs have changed, the companies have changed, their interests have changed. Jesus knew. He already sensed his connection to God at the age of 12. Sometimes we underestimate where children are spiritually and how strong their call of God is in their lives. I've learned as a pastor to listen when children ask spiritual questions because sometimes there's something really going on in their lives. Sometimes they're a little bit like Samuel, the prophet. who hears God calling in the night, and it starts off something very profound. You don't know where that call is going to take you. He knew that his priorities were with God first. Very often we find ourselves struggling a little bit to know what to do with children. And I think our text says something about Mary and Joseph. Because they may not have understood quite the path Jesus was on, but they showed in their own lives some priorities that evidently rubbed off on him and helped him grow. They were, the text says, going to Passover, as was their yearly custom. This is no small journey, as I said. It was probably a week-long journey, one way, to celebrate. Yes, they were going with a group of other people, some relatives and whatnot. That had a festive side to it. But they were showing to Jesus their priorities. And how many of us parents perhaps find ourselves struggling with showing our kids our real spiritual priorities? Years ago, a man that I buried from this church had said to me that as his kids were growing up, every Sunday he made sure he had an offering envelope in the offering. He said, I tended to give once a month, really, in what I was going to give that month. But I wanted my kids to see me give every week. Might have only been $1 or $5, but I wanted them to know that church was important to me. And of course, one of the problems we deal with in life is that Americans get themselves so overloaded with stuff. Dr. Richard Swenson wrote a book called The Overload Syndrome, in which he talked about the average American work week now exceeds just about every other nation on the planet. Most homes are dual income with a combined total workload exceeding 90 hours a week. And then we get ourselves involved in all kinds of other things, our kids' sports or whatnot. We're not perhaps spending enough time with our kids and not conveying our faith as well as we should. Many parents would never let their kids skip school, but if it was a late Saturday night, it's very easy to say, well, we'll skip church today. What are we telling our kids? A young boy was asked if he believed in God, and he answered, well, yes, I do. And when asked why, he said, well, I think it just runs in the family. And we can laugh about that. But the fact is, I could ask you, does it run in your family? I'd note here, too, that parents have to be very careful not to be standing in the way of their kids' calls to God, because God may be calling them or their grandchildren or great-grandchildren in a direction that throws you a little bit for a loop. A friend I was confirmed with, he and his girlfriend, now his wife, had dinner with Nate and I when I was in seminary, and he made a comment that was very true. He said, you know, growing up, which of us do you think the people at church would have expected to go into the ministry? And I've said this before. He was very talented musically, very outgoing personality, he's very smart. And then he said those damning words, but my parents would have had a fit. They would have thought I would have wasted my education. And it struck me at that time, and it struck me as I was thinking about it now. Both of our fathers were on various church boards in the church we grew up in. We were both confirmed by the same pastor. Each of our fathers was Sunday school superintendent, and also would end up being chairman of the church at various times. His parents had a commitment to church, but heaven help him if God had called him to ministry. Now, I have no idea if God did call him to ministry. But the fact is, we as parents sometimes get in the way of God's calling, not just to ministry, but we want our kids to be such and such an occupation. We don't take into consideration what our kids' personality is like, what their giftedness is. As I've often said, they might be good with numbers, but they might not have the personality to sit down and be an actuary or a statistician. Because that may not fit their personality. It just may not be exciting enough for them. God has a plan for them. Are we allowing them to follow God's plan? Or do we short-circuit it? I appreciate that something that Rose Kennedy, the matriarch of the family that gave us a president and 2 senators, once said. She said, whenever I hold a newborn in my arms, I used to think what I did and what I said to that child would have an influence not only on the child, but on everyone that child would meet. Not just for a day, not just for a year, but for many, many years. She said, it's a real challenge, but also a joy. It's a challenge and a joy. Mary and Joseph were not helicopter parents, but they evidently were attentive to the needs of their son. They did not necessarily understand him. Later on in life, when he's in his ministry, we see that Mary and some of his siblings came and questioned Jesus and thought maybe he had lost his mind. But they provided a solid basis of learning. And we have to give Joseph a lot of credit here. It was the father's job to teach the sons the things of God in Scripture. And he must have done a very good job. He may not have known what his son would become, but he wanted his son to know the things of God. Mary and Joseph loved Jesus, and he loved them. And they brought him up to love God. And it's no wonder at age 12 that he was aware that he had a special relationship with God. I hope your children and grandchildren, whatever their age, know they have a special relationship with God too. But of course, they may not have one if you don't have a special relationship with God. Do you have a relationship with God that shows them that Christ is Lord and Savior? That God makes the choices in your life, and you're following his leading. If you do, they are more likely to find that path themselves.